It is January 20th, 2025. 2 months earlier, Donald Trump narrowly avenged his 2020 loss to Joe Biden. Upon being sworn into office, the first declaration that Trump makes is to officially review all aid to Ukraine and terminate it. The war thus ends in short order. Well, maybe. That is what we are going to interrogate here today, because that argument has the classic structure of Step 1, something plausible, Step 2, Step 3, a seemingly reasonable conclusion. Indeed, this structure is a popular one, covering everything from business models to Russia's escalate to de-escalate strategy. But without an explicit Step 2, we do not have a valid argument. And indeed, the basic version of this story completely falls apart once you start putting some lines on maps. Hey, you know the channel that you are on, and we are definitely lining it up today. Instead, the default expectation that arises is something much, much worse for Ukraine and the West. This does not mean that Step 3 is wrong, just that we need to do a lot more work to get there. But depending upon what you think is true about the world, then yeah, it might be wrong. So, on tap for today, we will discuss the tempting logic that suggests that cutting aid will end the war, an immediate problem involving where the bulk of Ukraine's aid flows are coming from, hint, it is Europe, the problem with conflating goals and coercion with a state's ideal outcome, one of the more important findings that people on my side of international relations have learned over the last 30 years that overrides that logic, and then 3 issues that, if aid is cut, could make the problem better or worse. Those are disagreement over the expected outcome of the war, long-term shifts in the balance of power, and the private benefits that the Kremlin is trying to accrue. Quick starting note first. We are just going to assume that Trump will, 1, win the election, and 2, if he indeed wins the election, he will then cut the aid. Regarding point 2, in a previous video, I have explained why that is not a certainty. So if you care about that, check out that video. Otherwise, this is just how logical deduction works. You make assumptions, such as assuming that aid will be cut. Then you do the logical analysis, and you know my preferred method, and then you draw conclusions. Your conclusions are only as good as your assumptions, of course. So, garbage in, garbage out. Logically valid garbage, but garbage nonetheless. At least with this one, it is perfectly reasonable to think that Trump will indeed cut aid, even if it is not a guarantee. In fact, Viktor Orban's comments coming out of a private meeting with Trump underscored that point. Not a penny, though a source close to Trump alleges that the former president never said that. I'm with the PM here that this is giving me a giant headache. In any case, we will stick with the not a penny thing. And instead, the real work that we will be doing in this video is manipulating the other key assumptions, and then analyzing how cut aid affects each of those, so that we can ultimately reach some conclusions. Regarding the first of our starting points, the polling is humorously all over the place, but is maybe, tilting slightly toward Trump. Fun side game. Which of these headlines is from Fox News, and which is from MSNBC? Yeah, I guess that was pretty straightforward, wasn't it? In any case, the point is that things look something resembling a coin flip. Now, writing this part of the video was difficult for me. Algorithms feed us links that we are more likely to click, which leads to selective reporting. Indeed, this poll received much greater coverage from the right. I know this thanks to the returning sponsor for today's video, Ground News. Reading that same report on Ground News, 65 articles cover the story, but only about 13% of them were left-leaning sources, which means if algorithms know your habits, you may never have seen this poll. Even if you did, depending upon where you got your information from, you may have read a very different narrative, and thus your perception of where the 2024 election is going may be distorted. In a nutshell, Ground News shows you everything in one place, so you can see all sides and come to your own conclusions. That means you can cover your blind spots and read stories that algorithms are hiding from you, whether we are talking about US elections or what is happening around the world. That is a worthy goal, and that is why I'm proud to be partnering with Ground News again. To give it a try, go to ground.news/linesonmaps. If you sign up using my link, you will receive 40% off the Vantage plan. That is what I use to get unlimited access to all features. I think Ground News is doing important work, so I hope you will check them out. With that, let's start with the basic logic of why Trump's plan would seem to generate the anticipated result. The idea is that Russia wants to annex parts of Ukraine into the Federation. What is stopping that from happening at the moment is Ukrainian military resistance. Resistance only made possible by aid from Western countries. So, Trump comes in, the aid to Ukraine terminates, Russia takes what it wants, and then the war just ends. It will be a dark day for Ukraine for sure, but there is not much that the policymakers in Kyiv can do about it. Presumably, the benefit to the United States is a return to normal-ish trade relations with Russia, and the economic efficiency that comes with that. There is some hand-waving here about European aid, though, and that takes us to the next major point: the origins of aid to Ukraine. Over the first 2 years of the war, the United States contributed $46 billion in military aid, which is about 39% of total receipts. Note that this does not include the to-be-distributed $61 billion package, though Europe is also making new contributions. The point is, as it pertains to historical aid flows, Trump would not control the majority of them. Furthermore, in the absence of US assistance, one imagines that Europe would increase its flows. Actually, you can see this if you go past the military stuff and look at total aid figures, which also include financial and humanitarian aid. By that metric, the United States' contribution is $75 billion. Worldwide, the total quantity is $278 billion, meaning that Washington's share is just 27%. In fact, the European Union's contribution exceeds that of the United States at $93 billion, and that excludes bilateral flows like Germany's $24 billion. So, already, we have a problem with the idea that Ukraine would suddenly lose all capacity if the United States pulls out. Now, it is worth noting that the reason why the United States provides relatively more military aid than economic aid or humanitarian aid is because Uncle Sam excels at making things explode. Thus, dollar for dollar, replacing some American weapons systems with some European weapons systems might not give as great of a return on investment. But the point remains that Ukraine will not become militarily insolvent under a Trump presidency. Europe actually contributes quite a bit. And with that, we turn to the core of the logical problem: goals versus ideals. Before getting to the lines on maps, the simple summary of the problem is that observers often conflate "these are my coercive goals" with "this is what my ideal world looks like" if there were no military constraints. One of these is a function of coercive power. The other is not, and that distinction is even built into the words. Let's rewind to September 2022. With the stroke of this pen, Russian law said that Luhansk, Donetsk, Zaporizhia, and Kherson Oblasts were now a part of the Russian Federation. One version of the aid cut logic is, Assumption 1, Russia's goal is to annex those 4 oblasts. Assumption 2, without aid, Ukraine cannot defend these areas. And with that, Step 1, withdraw aid. Step 2, Russia can take the oblasts. And Step 3, with Russia's goals met, the war ends. The problem here is in Assumption 1, and thinking that this is what Russia wants in the absence of military constraints, when it is actually a coercive goal. In other words, the line representing the stopping point for Russia is a function of the current distribution of power. If you change the distribution of power, say by cutting US aid to Ukraine, then it just shifts the goal. No longer is it the first set of oblasts, it is now the second set of oblasts, or more. If we actually wanted to narrow down what Russia's ideal outcome would be in the absence of military constraints, the best we have to go on is Dmitry Medvedev's comments, which put things all the way to the edges of Kyiv. Even that has to come with the caveat that Russia tried for more at the beginning of the conflict. But the sensibility of that attempt was a function of Russian expectations of how pliable average Ukrainians would be to accepting Russian integration, which turned out to be not much at all. I am also obligated by my own research record to note that Russia might not even ideally want to go that far, despite the line on the map that Medvedev drew. There is an incentive to act like Russia wants more, to scare Ukraine into conceding more. But at least the way that intelligence analysts interpreted the Medvedev claim, I think the conventional wisdom is that this line is sincere. Okay, now let's visually work through that logic with our trusty lines on maps, which will reveal a deeper problem with the theory. Here is our favorite white line, a hypothetical expected outcome of war following a military conclusion. As a reminder, it combines what Russia would take if Ukraine militarily collapses, what Ukraine would implement if Russia militarily collapses, and the various different types of entrenched stalemates that might form otherwise. Assign each of those a probability, calculate the weighted average, and you get the hypothetical line in question. Then draw this red line so that the space between reflects how Russia internalizes the costs of war in terms of square kilometers of territory, and the literal red line now represents the figurative red line of what Russia prefers to accept as compared to running the risks of war. The yellow line is analogous for Ukraine, but going in the opposite direction. Thus, divisions between the yellow and red lines improve upon both parties' war outcomes. Now let's think about how altering the military balance affects this, say by denying Ukraine further aid. Well, remember that this white line is the average military outcome of war. If you take Ukraine and make it militarily weaker, then the average outcome of war shifts westward toward Kyiv. Moreover, remember back a moment ago to how the red and yellow lines were drawn. They are affixed a certain distance from the white line. So when you move the white line, you shift the red and yellow ones as well. Thus, the main effects of changing the balance of power are to make Russia more inclined to press for further gains, and to make Ukraine more inclined to reluctantly concede them without any better options. I cannot stress enough how central this result is to coercive bargaining. To wit, I double-checked the textbook, and it appears 9 times. We also talked about it not too long ago in the context of Taiwan and the PRC's problems with missile launches. What's more, this exercise highlights another problem with the logic. When a war occurs, it is despite the fact that the divisions between the red and yellow lines are better for both parties. Consequently, if Trump cutting aid is going to end the war, we first need to articulate why the war was happening at all, and then what cutting aid did to resolve that problem and allow them to reach an agreement that was infeasible beforehand. So, what to do? Well, for the rest of this video, we are going to look at 3 different mechanisms that cause bargaining breakdown and are plausible for the current situation. Then we will examine how eliminating US aid could either increase the chances or decrease the chances of ending the war, given those mechanisms for bargaining failure. And, as a reminder, if you want a slower introduction to the logic of lines on maps, there is always this video. Alright, let's begin with private information as a cause of the war. The basic idea here is that one party knows something that the other does not, which then makes them believe that they are more likely to win the war than the other side believes. One straightforward way that Trump's cut could end the war is if there is disagreement about the cut itself. Perhaps Ukraine is more optimistic that Trump will lose the election, or that, conditional on him winning, he is not likely to actually make any changes. Well, Trump winning and then cutting aid would answer both of those questions. One way or another, the expectations converge. We then reach some sort of end to the conflict, with the location determined by who was right. However, aid reductions could also make information problems worse. For example, what if there is disagreement between the parties over just how far Russia could go? Not in general, but specifically in the absence of US support. To put some more bones on that possibility, the reason that Russia failed in its February 2022 push toward Kyiv was because the planning and readiness of Russian forces was horrendous. Part of the reason that Russia has done well over the last year or so is because the Kremlin mostly rectified those problems. If US aid is making a deep push irrelevant because it is enough to keep Russia in the Eastern Theater, then any disagreement on this point is moot. But cutting the aid then puts Kyiv into focus and leaves us further from an end to the war. For our second source of bargaining failure, let's try shifting power. This is the idea that the outcome of a war depends on whether it is fought now or later, and even the best possible settlement that one party could expect to receive in the future is worse than what it expects to obtain by fighting now. For example, if Ukraine believes that aid flows in the present will exceed aid flows in the future, then it has a strong incentive to keep the war going, to prevent Russia from exploiting a temporary peace. By doing so, it can attrit Russian forces, and thereby reduce the consequences of having US military aid restricted in the future. If that is the hang-up that is prolonging the war, then Trump's victory and subsequent aid cut could end the conflict. Like before, this is because the shadow of Trump's election is what was driving the war in the first place. On the flip side, it might exacerbate the problem from Russia's perspective. Imagine that Putin views a second Trump term as a unique opportunity. His spell in office can only last 4 years due to the 22nd Amendment, and other Republicans are not as Eurosceptical as he is, especially now that Congress passed the aid package. In that case, Putin might feel like he must do as much as he can over Ukraine's 4-year period of vulnerability. Again, that would put peace in a worse position than before the election. For a final source of bargaining failure, let's look at private benefits. This is the idea that war may not be costly for a leader, and in fact there are direct benefits for fighting or winning the war. Now there is no space to the left of the red line that is simultaneously right of the yellow line. Thus, the whole thing explodes. For example, suppose that Putin believes that his tenure is at disproportionately great risk if he settles for a small portion of territory, say just this part of the Donbass that he visited back in March 2023. Continuing to fight is risky because he might lose further, but it is also possible that the upside benefit is so high that it outweighs the downside risk, as depicted before. Here, Trump's withdrawal of the aid makes the upside benefit more likely, and thus makes it more tempting for Putin to pursue. Again, that would take us further from an end to the war. On the other hand, suppose that Putin's direct benefit only comes from controlling the initial 4 oblasts. Remember, those are the ones that Russia has made a formal claim on already, so failing to capture the next set of oblasts might not matter one way or another to the average Russian. In turn, it now becomes easier for the Kremlin to capture the private benefit. But once that has happened, then there is no need for the war to continue. This is the closest way that we can recreate the original superficial logic. Critically, though, there are a lot of extra assumptions that go into this that need to be true for it to work out. Actually, revealing hidden assumptions is a big reason why people like me spend so much time building models to understand war. If you want a comprehensive but digestible version of the logic, you will love this book on the causes of Russia's invasion. Check the video description for more information on that. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I will see you next time. Take care.